Welcome to The Debate, where we explore substantive issues through thoughtful disagreement, illuminating different perspectives from the material before us. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fundamental question of governance that profoundly impacts every citizen. Does an expansive government, characterized by progressive policies like universal health care and, ambitious environmental programs, ultimately benefit or hinder the nation's economic prosperity and individual well-being? This isn't just an abstract academic exercise. This discussion emerges directly from recent political discourse, significant policy implementations at both state and federal levels, and, rigorous analyses of differing governance philosophies found in our source material. I'll be arguing that such expansive policies are not just beneficial, but actually essential for achieving true social justice and fostering robust, equitable economic growth.
And I come at it from a fundamentally different perspective. While the stated intentions of these policies are often laudable, I'll be highlighting the significant, often overlooked limitations and potential drawbacks of this expansive government approach. I contend it frequently leads to ballooning inefficiencies, excessive, frankly unsustainable costs, and a concerning erosion of individual liberties.
Okay, so to kick us off, I'd argue that expansive government policies aren't just, a good idea. They're absolutely vital for tackling those deep-seated inequalities, ensuring social justice, and truly building a stable, equitable society. And ultimately, that's the bedrock for national prosperity and improved well-being for everyone. Let's start with healthcare, A foundational human right, and, frankly, an economic stabilizer. California's unwavering commitment to expanding Medi-Cal eligibility to all low-income, undocumented adults by 2024. Now, that comes at an annual cost of $2.7 billion, yes, but it's a concrete, impactful step towards universal health care. This isn't merely about charity. It's a strategic investment in public health and, crucially, societal stability. We see that almost every other developed nation in the world has universal health care. And these countries consistently demonstrate a remarkable 3 to 5 years longer life expectancy for males compared to the U.S. Now, this isn't just a statistical blip. It paints a clear picture. Government intervention in healthcare directly translates into years added to people's lives, fundamentally reshaping public health outcomes. When people are healthy, they're more productive, they contribute more to the economy, and the overall burden on emergency rooms, it's significantly reduced. That's a clear long-term economic benefit right there. Furthermore, let's consider economic equity. Progressive platforms, such as those passionately advocated by figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they propose wealth taxes, significantly increased taxes on corporations and high earners, and a higher federal minimum wage, pushing for $15 an hour. These are punitive measures. They are carefully designed mechanisms to reduce the growing, destabilizing gap between rich and poor, leading to a more equitable and stable society. The idea here really is that a truly thriving economy requires broad participation and shared prosperity. When wealth is concentrated so heavily at the top, demand suffers, social mobility stagnates, and the entire economic engine can, seize up. These policies aim to redistribute resources in a way that fuels broader consumer spending, reduces the societal cost tied to poverty, and ultimately creates a more resilient, dynamic economy for all. And speaking of long-term investment, consider climate action, often framed as an economic burden, right? But California's experience, it paints a strikingly different picture. Their journey is highly instructive here. Despite fears of stifling growth, California is now the world's fourth largest economy.
Yet its greenhouse gas emissions have actually decreased by 20% since 2000, while its GDP simultaneously surged by 78%. That's
quite remarkable.
California even achieved 2/3 clean energy in 2023, making it the largest economy globally to do so. This powerfully refutes the deeply ingrained belief that environmental stewardship must come at the expense of economic vitality. This suggests a paradigm shift. Ambitious environmental programs, like those envisioned in the Green New Deal, don't inherently stifle economic growth. In fact, they can potentially catalyze green economic prosperity, creating new industries, new jobs, and fostering innovation. This is a critical insight, I think, for nations grappling with similar challenges, showing that proactive government leadership on climate can be a pathway to both environmental sustainability and economic dynamism.
Advocate, while you cite California's impressive economic growth alongside emissions reduction, and those numbers are admittedly striking, aren't you overlooking the very real and immediate fiscal failures within other state programs? I mean, how do you reconcile that $11.4 billion in mismanaged unemployment benefits with this notion of efficient government expansion?
Well, no program is perfect, but
Right, but while the aims of these expansive government programs often sound positive and, yes, noble in theory, the reality is that increased regulation and broad top-down interventions frequently incur significant, often hidden costs. They foster deep-seated inefficiencies and, unfortunately, they create ample opportunities for fraud. These issues ultimately hinder true economic prosperity and can gravely infringe upon individual liberties. Let's delve deeper into the economic viability and fiscal responsibility you touched upon. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal proposals, while undeniably ambitious in scope, they are heavily criticized for their, quote, lack of detailed plans for implementation and funding. The estimated costs are astronomical, roughly $2.5 trillion per year, financed primarily by higher taxes on the wealthy. This isn't just a large number. This scale raises serious, fundamental concerns about economic feasibility. How do you tax the wealthy to this extent without driving capital out of the country, stifling investment, or, disincentivizing the very entrepreneurship that's vital for job creation and overall economic health? The potential burden on taxpayers and the wider economy, well, it simply cannot be understated. And we've already seen stark examples of government programs struggling with efficiency and accountability. The Newsom administration in California, despite its progressive aims, experienced staggering issues with its unemployment benefits program. It mismanaged a shocking $11.4 billion paid to ineligible claimants, with an additional $19 billion currently under investigation for fraud. Now, this isn't an isolated incident or a minor hiccup. It vividly illustrates the inherent challenges, the profound potential for waste, and the direct cost to taxpayers when government expands its administrative functions and spending to such an unprecedented degree. These are not abstract long-term investments. These are billions of dollars directly siphoned away, money that could have been used much more productively elsewhere. Moreover, this argument for government expansion often comes with very real and concerning risks to individual liberties and due process, which are, let's face it, cornerstones of a free society. The second Trump administration's immigration policies, for example, were marked by a disturbing disregard for process. This included the revocation of sensitive locations guidance, meaning places like schools, hospitals, and churches were no longer considered off-limits for immigration enforcement. That's a major shift. They also reassigned personnel from agencies like the DEA and ATF for immigration tasks, newly exploited IRS tax data from unauthorized immigrants, and critically invoked the Alien Enemies Act, a wartime statute rarely used in modern history to deport alleged gang members without court hearings. These actions, along with reported cases of U.S. citizen children being removed, they suggest a concerning and dangerous expansion of executive authority that bypassed traditional checks and balances. This created what's described as a climate of fear and represents a profound erosion of individual liberties and constitutional norms, effectively reshaping American civics and democracy. Now, even if some voters initially supported harsh enforcement tactics, the material notes 9 in 10 Republicans did for mass deportation. The methods used here raise serious questions about the limits of government power and due process. The underlying philosophy of the Trump administration, on the other hand, emphasized American exceptionalism, deregulation, and a smaller, less intrusive government. They actively sought to limit government intervention, operating under the belief that less government fosters greater economic freedom and allows individual ingenuity to flourish.
I understand your concern about potential executive overreach, dissenter, and I fully agree that checks and balances are absolutely non-negotiable for a healthy democracy. But is providing essential health care, even for undocumented immigrants, is that really an overreach of government? Or is it a fundamental humanitarian function that ultimately benefits the entire public health ecosystem? When you look at the life expectancy gap between the U.S. and countries with universal health care, the crushing costs of chronic illness on families and our economy, and the truly devastating economic impact of climate disasters, well, the argument for early, comprehensive government investment becomes not just compelling, but frankly irrefutable.
The $2.7 billion California allocates for Medi-Cal expansion, it's an investment that prevents more expensive emergency room visits down the line. It reduces the spread of disease within communities and allows individuals to contribute more fully to society. The cost of inaction on these fronts, whether it's unaddressed public health or unchecked climate change, is far, far greater and falls disproportionately on our most vulnerable populations. You cite the $11.4 billion in mismanaged unemployment benefits as evidence of inherent inefficiency.
Any large-scale system, public or private, faces challenges with fraud and administrative errors. The crucial question isn't if these issues exist, but whether they negate the fundamental necessity and overall positive impact of the program itself. California's economic growth, alongside its climate leadership, which we discussed earlier, isn't an anomaly. It demonstrates that government can be efficient and forward-thinking in its investments when properly managed.
Advocate, I appreciate your emphasis on long-term investment, but I'm just not convinced that these theoretical long-term gains can justify or even mitigate the very real and immediate losses we see in practice. You seem to gloss over that $11.4 billion in mismanaged unemployment benefits and an additional $19 billion under fraud investigation in California as if they are simply manageable challenges. But these aren't minor operational glitches. These are billions of taxpayer dollars lost due to significant administrative failures and outright fraud. That's money that was intended for those genuinely in need, instead lining the pockets of criminals, or perhaps just disappearing into bureaucratic black holes. How can we possibly entrust a government that demonstrates such profound fiscal irresponsibility with an additional, $2.5 trillion per year for something as expansive and, let's be honest, vaguely defined in parts as the Green New Deal? The costs aren't just abstract. They impose a direct burden on taxpayers, diverting resources from potentially more efficient private sector investments, and could very well lead to inflation or decreased global competitiveness. When you continuously rely on increased tax on the wealthy, you seriously risk disincentivizing wealth creation, which then ultimately hurts job growth and the very economic prosperity you seek to foster. And while the promise of long-term economic gains is certainly appealing, advocate the practical cost isn't just measured in dollars lost to inefficiency. It often comes at the expense of fundamental individual liberties and due process, which is an equally critical, if not more critical, burden of expansive government. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that expanding government powers, even for what are framed as human rights, can be easily separated from the very real risks of overreach that can quickly spiral out of control. The Trump administration's expanded government powers in immigration enforcement offer a stark example. The revocation of sensitive locations guidance, meaning schools, hospitals, churches no longer off-limits for enforcement, the use of IRS data against unauthorized immigrants, and critically, the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, that wartime statute, to deport alleged gang members without court hearings, marked an alarming bypassing of fundamental due process.
A clear misuse of power, yes.
A misuse enabled by an expansive view of executive authority, perhaps? These actions, described as a disregard for process and creating a climate of fear, directly demonstrate a dangerous erosion of individual liberties and constitutional norms. This reshaping of American civics and democracy, it bypasses fundamental protections that we, as a nation, should cherish above almost anything else. Where do you draw the line, advocate, when a government decides that its expansive goals justify such an erosion of basic rights?
And I fully agree that due process is paramount. However, your examples from the Trump administration illustrate, I believe, a misuse of executive power, rather than an inherent flaw in the concept of expansive government itself when it's focused on public good and human rights.
Is providing essential healthcare for all, even undocumented immigrants, truly an overreach of government? Or is it a fundamental humanitarian function that ultimately benefits the entire public health ecosystem and strengthens the social fabric? California's policy to make all low-income adults eligible for Medi-Cal, regardless of immigration status, that ensures that basic dignity and necessary care are provided.
This isn't about eroding liberties. It's about ensuring a healthier, more stable populace, which arguably enhances the overall liberty and well-being of the community by preventing widespread disease and reducing the strain on emergency services. Similarly, policies advocating for a pathway to citizenship for groups like Dreamers, TPS holders, those with temporary protected status, farm workers, and essential workers, they're about ensuring stability and equal recognition. This reflects government's legitimate and necessary role in upholding dignity, opportunity, and indeed, expanding the definition of well-being and security for more people within its borders. Now, let's shift our focus slightly, maybe to how political styles themselves impact the acceptance and implementation of these expansive government policies. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She exemplifies a direct, passionate, and deeply engaging communication style that has proven incredibly effective in connecting with diverse voters, including, interestingly, some who previously voted for Trump, according to the material. Her adept use of social media and public engagement, like her highly popular Twitch streams for charity, genuinely humanized her to hundreds of thousands of viewers. She doesn't just present policy points, she connects with people on things that voters care about, which is crucial for building broader coalitions and fostering greater collaboration and co-creation in policymaking. Think about initiatives like California's Engaged California digital democracy effort, which aims to bring citizens directly into policy formation. This style demonstrates that progressive ideas, when communicated authentically and directly, can resonate deeply and potentially bridge divides.
It's about building trust and showing that expansive government can work with the people, not just sort of dictate to them.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the style you're describing always leads to greater collaboration or understanding, especially in the context of implementing complex, expansive government policies. While direct engagement can be powerful, Donald Trump's bombastic and unfiltered style offers a contrasting, yet in its own way, equally effective approach to mobilizing voters, though, with very different and often polarizing consequences, as you alluded to. His us versus them rhetoric and framing of immigration as an invasion or carnage, well, it clearly tapped into the emotional self-interest of his base, particularly among what has been termed the white disenfranchised. This confrontational style, while undeniably effective at galvanizing his core supporters, can be incredibly polarizing for the wider electorate.
It actively creates mistrust and misunderstanding across political lines, and often distracts from substantive policy debates, instead fueling emotional reactions. Despite his initial success in rallying support, it's telling, I think, that polls eventually showed more Americans opposing Trump's specific immigration enforcement approach. This suggests a limit to the appeal of such a highly confrontational and, frankly, at times dehumanizing style. So the question isn't just about galvanizing a base. It's about whether a political style is truly conducive to the long-term health of civic discourse, fostering the kind of consensus needed for any effective governance, expansive or otherwise. How can we have a meaningful debate on complex issues like universal healthcare or massive climate programs when the very language used creates such deep divisions and distrust?
Dissenter, while Trump's style surely mobilized a base, it often did so by, as you say, alienating others and undermining the very institutions required for stable governance. Ocasio-Cortez's approach, despite its progressive fervor, arguably aims to bridge divides by humanizing policy and connecting on shared needs, perhaps creating a pathway for wider acceptance of expansive governance. If progressive policies are inherently about collective well-being and require large-scale societal shifts, then a communication style that fosters co-creation and direct engagement isn't just about galvanizing a base. It's about building genuine consensus and public will for these significant government programs. It acknowledges that people need to feel heard and represented, not just dictated to, for expansive policies to truly take root and succeed.
But is it genuine consensus if it's potentially based more on emotional appeals rather than a rigorous vetting of the practicalities and costs? Look, the very bombastic style we just critiqued, whether from the right or the left, often sacrifices nuance and detailed planning for passionate rhetoric. While the idea of co-creation sounds appealing, the reality is that many expansive government proposals, particularly those we've discussed like the Green New Deal, face significant criticism for a lack of detailed plans for implementation and funding. A compelling style might get a policy proposed, yes, but it won't make an economically unfeasible plan suddenly viable or solve the administrative inefficiencies that seem to plague large government endeavors. This risks creating a cycle of enthusiasm followed by disillusionment, ultimately undermining trust in government's ability to deliver effectively.
I think it's important to recognize, though, that an expansive government, when thoughtfully guided by principles of social justice, economic equity, and environmental stewardship, can effectively address pressing societal challenges that, frankly, no other entity has the scale or scope to tackle. Despite the inherent complexities and the costs you've rightly pointed out, such an approach has the potential to create a more stable, inclusive society and ultimately foster greater collective prosperity and individual well-being for all. The evidence from California's dual success in economic growth and environmental protection and the improved health outcomes in nations with universal health care strongly suggests that strategic, proactive government intervention can lead to tangible, profound, and overwhelmingly positive results.
For significant fiscal burdens that strain taxpayers, the persistent challenge of administrative inefficiencies and outright fraud that waste precious resources, and the alarming erosion of individual liberties and democratic norms that can accompany an overreach of executive power, regardless of intention. I believe that a more constrained, efficient, and accountable government focused diligently on its core functions and respecting fundamental individual rights, well, that might better safeguard both economic prosperity and the foundational principles of a free society, which are paramount for long-term well-being and a truly thriving nation.
It's clear that the optimal balance between government intervention and individual autonomy remains a complex and ongoing discussion that really defines much of our political and economic landscape.
Indeed, there are valid arguments and compelling evidence on both sides of this crucial debate, and it's a tension that continues to shape our choices as a nation. We hope our listeners will continue to explore these critical tensions within the material themselves and truly weigh the implications of each approach going forward.